In the late autumn of 1943, somewhere in the United States, American engineers captured a German staff car from North Africa and tore it apart. It was elegant, comfortable, designed by Ferdinand Porsche himself. When they finished testing, they wrote their verdict in a classified manual that wouldn't be published until March 1945. The Volkswagen is inferior in every way except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. But here's what that manual couldn't capture. When German troops captured American jeeps in the Egyptian desert, in Sicily, in Italy, in France, they didn't destroy them. They fought to keep them. Wehrmacht units repainted them with German crosses and pressed them into service so often that German vehicle inventories had to be amended. Otto Skorzeny, the most famous commando in the German army, built his most ambitious operation of the war around one requirement: get me as many captured American jeeps as you can find. By the end of the war, the man who commanded the Allied armies would call the jeep one of 4 pieces of equipment most vital to victory in Europe. Not a weapon designed for combat. A quarter-ton truck that weighed less than a Tiger tank's bumper armor. It was designed in 5 days by a 56-year-old engineer who was broke, out of work, and said no twice before he finally said yes. His name was Karl Probst, and he died nearly forgotten. ACT-1A. The Call Summer, 1940. France had fallen 3 weeks earlier. The photographs from Paris showed German soldiers marching beneath the Arc de Triomphe while French citizens wept on the sidewalks. In London, Winston Churchill was preparing his people for invasion. In Washington, George Catlett Marshall, the newly appointed Chief of Staff of the United States Army, was staring at a problem he had been staring at for years. His army could not move, not fast enough, not far enough, not across the kind of ground where wars were actually fought. The previous August, during the Plattsburgh maneuvers in upstate New York, Marshall had watched 52,000 American troops attempt the largest peacetime military exercise in the nation's history. They had horses. They had motorcycles. They had Model T Fords that worked beautifully on paved roads and sank axle deep the moment they left them. The motorcycles fell over in mud. The horses ate too much and moved too slowly. The officers still relied on written orders carried by men on foot, the same way armies had communicated since Julius Caesar. Marshall had served in France in 1918. He knew what mud did to armies. He knew what happened when orders arrived too late and wounded men died waiting for help that never came. On the 11th of July 1940, 2 weeks after France surrendered, the United States Army Quartermaster Corps sent specifications to 135 American automobile manufacturers. The requirements were brutal. 4-wheel drive, empty weight not to exceed 1,300 pounds, payload of 660 pounds, wheelbase of 75 inches, engine capable of at least 85 foot-pounds of torque. Fold-down windshield, speed range from 3 to 50 miles per hour, a rear bench seat for 3 soldiers and a machine gun. Bids were due in 11 days. A working prototype was due in 49. 133 companies threw the specifications in the trash. The deadline was considered a joke. Building an entirely new vehicle from scratch in 7 weeks was not engineering. It was fantasy. 2 companies responded. One was Willys Overland Motors in Toledo, Ohio, a mid-sized manufacturer with a strong engineering department and access to capital. The other was the American Bantam Car Company in Butler, Pennsylvania. Bantam was dying. The company had been building small, European-style economy cars that almost nobody wanted to buy. The Great Depression had gutted their sales. Their workforce had been laid off. Their engineering staff was gone. They were operating out of a nearly empty factory with almost no cash and no realistic prospect of survival past the end of the year. On the 17th of July 1940, 7 days after the Army's specifications went out, the president of American Bantam picked up a telephone and called a 56-year-old freelance automotive engineer in Detroit named Karl Probst. Probst was between jobs. That was the polite way of saying it. The real way of saying it was that Probst was 56 years old in an industry that hired men in their 30s, and he was running out of money. He had been building automobiles in one form or another since the early years of the century. He was the son of a country doctor from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. He understood engines the way some men understood horses. He could look at a problem, strip it down to its essential geometry, and solve it with whatever materials were on hand. But in the summer of 1940, those skills were not paying the rent. Bantam's president made his pitch. The Army wanted a light reconnaissance vehicle. Bantam had the contract opportunity but no engineers to design it. The bid was due in 4 days. If they won the bid, a working prototype was due in 7 weeks. Probst said no. The president pleaded. The company was going under. This contract could save them. Probst was the only engineer they trusted who might be able to do this. Probst said no again. He knew what the timeline meant. You did not design a vehicle from scratch in 4 days. You did not build a working prototype in 7 weeks. It was engineering suicide. If he failed, and failure was almost certain, his name would be attached to the failure. At 56, in an industry that had already decided he was too old, that failure would be the last thing anyone remembered. Then a man named William Knudsen called. Knudsen had been the president of General Motors. He had just been recruited by the federal government to take charge of all army procurement. He had the kind of voice that made you stand up straighter when you heard it on the other end of a telephone line. He told Probst the country needed him. Probst was silent for a long time. Then he got into his car and started driving east. ACT-1B, 5 days in hell, Karl Probst arrived in Butler, Pennsylvania on the evening of the 17th of July, 1940. The Bantam factory was mostly empty. The drafting room was nearly empty. There were desks, drawing boards, compasses, straightedges, and paper. There was no engineering team, no support staff. No one to double-check the math, or run the preliminary calculations, or tell Probst whether what he was attempting was even possible. There was just Probst, a desk, and a set of specifications that would have been difficult to meet in 6 months. He had 4 days. Probst understood almost immediately that there was only one way to do this. He could not invent anything new. There was no time for invention. There was barely time for assembly. What he could do, what he had to do, was take existing components, parts that were already in production and sitting in warehouses, and arrange them in a way no one had arranged them before. The engine would come from Continental Motors, a 4-cylinder side valve unit producing about 45 horsepower. It was a tractor engine, fundamentally, but it was reliable and it was available. The transmission would come from Warner Gear, the transfer case would come from Spicer, the axles would be modified Studebaker Champion units also supplied through Spicer. Probst was not designing a car. He was designing a mechanical argument, a proof that these components, bolted together in this specific configuration, could do what the Army said it needed done. He worked through Wednesday night. He worked through Thursday. On Friday afternoon, the 19th of July, he completed the basic layout drawings. He had been awake for something close to 40 hours. His hand was cramping. His eyes burned. He took Friday evening off and went to see a movie. On Saturday and Sunday, he finalized the cost calculations and the supplier specifications. Every number had to be verified. Every part had to be sourced. Every dimension had to be checked against the Army's requirements, because if the design failed on a single technical point, the entire bid would be disqualified. On Monday morning, the 22nd of July, Probst and the Bantam plant manager loaded the documents into a car and drove 250 miles to the Quartermaster Corps Test Center at Camp Holabird on the southeast edge of Baltimore. They arrived on time. The Army reviewed the submission. There were only 3 bids in total: Bantam, Willys and Ford, which had entered late after the Army invited them. Bantam's design was the only one that met all the specifications as written. It was also the only one that had been completed by someone working essentially alone in 5 days with no budget and no staff. The Army accepted it. The contract was awarded conditionally. Bantam would have 49 days to build a working prototype and deliver it to Camp Holabird for testing. If the prototype failed, the contract would go to one of the other bidders. Probst went back to Butler and started building. ACT-1C. The portrait and the bet rail, the finished vehicle, was delivered on the 23rd of September 1940. Probst drove it himself. Bantam did not have the money to ship the prototype to Maryland, so Probst climbed into the seat, fired up the engine, and drove the vehicle roughly 250 miles from the factory in Butler to the gate at Camp Holabird. According to multiple accounts from Bantam staff, the vehicle pulled through the gate 30 minutes before the deadline. The Army put it through tests that would have destroyed most civilian cars. They drove it up slopes steep enough that the front wheels lifted off the ground. They drove it through sand pits and water crossings. They loaded it with weights that exceeded its rated capacity and drove it over broken terrain until the frame should have cracked. They hooked it to a light artillery piece and dragged it across a field. The vehicle did not break. The Army's conclusion, documented in internal memos, was that the Bantam reconnaissance car exceeded expectations. It was light, fast, maneuverable, and capable of carrying loads across terrain that would have stopped a truck twice its size. It was, in the language of the evaluators, the best candidate they had seen. Then, in October of 1940, the Army did something that Karl Probst would never quite forgive and never quite understand. They called a meeting. Probst and the Bantam leadership were told that the design had been accepted. The vehicle was excellent. The engineering was sound. But there was a problem. Bantam was too small. The Army was going to need thousands of these vehicles, possibly tens of thousands, and Bantam did not have the manufacturing capacity to produce them. The factory in Butler could not scale. The company did not have the capital to expand. If war came, and everyone in that room knew war was coming, Bantam would not be able to deliver the vehicles the Army would need. So the Army was going to do something else. They were going to take Probst's drawings, the blueprints he had created in 5 days, the specifications he had verified, the component list he had assembled, and they were going to hand them to Willys and Ford Motor Company. Both companies would be invited to produce their own versions of the vehicle based on Bantam's design. Probst was, according to the historical record, furious. This was intellectual property. This was his work. He had done what no one else could do, and now the government was simply giving it away to competitors who had more money and more political influence. The Army's response was bureaucratic and final. The contract stated that all designs submitted became government property. Bantam had agreed to those terms when they accepted the bid. The drawings now belonged to the United States Army, and the Army would distribute them as it saw fit. There was nothing Probst could do. Willys received the blueprints. Ford received the blueprints. Both companies had engineering departments 10 times the size of what Bantam had ever possessed. Both companies had access to capital that Bantam would never see. And both companies immediately set to work improving the design that Karl Probst had created in a nearly empty drafting room in Pennsylvania in the summer of 1940. Willys had something Probst did not have. They had an engineer named Delmar G. Roos, known to everyone as Barney, who had previously been the chief engineer at Studebaker. Roos had spent the previous 2 years modernizing an old Whippet 4-cylinder engine into a 60-horsepower motor that Willys called the Go Devil. He had run that engine flat out on a dynamometer for 100 continuous hours without failure. The engine Probst had used, the Continental 45-horsepower unit, had failed at 22 hours. The Go Devil was, simply, the best small military engine in the world. The Army told Willys to use it. The Army told Ford to use it. By July of 1941, the design had been standardized. Willys would produce the vehicle as the Model MB. Ford would produce the same vehicle with parts interchangeable down to the last bolt as the GPW. The W stood for Willys because Ford was building a Willys licensed design. In 1948, the Federal Trade Commission would rule after years of investigation that the original design honors belonged to neither Willys nor Ford but to American Bantam. By that point, it would not matter. By December of 1941, when the United States entered the war, Jeeps were rolling off production lines in Toledo and Dearborn at a pace Bantam could never have matched. By the time the war ended in 1945, Willys and Ford had built approximately 647,000 of them. Bantam built 2,675 before the army pushed them aside. The company survived by building trailers. 74,000 quarter-ton trailers, designed to be towed behind the jeeps that Bantam had invented and could no longer produce. Bantam never returned to building cars. The company declared bankruptcy in 1950 and was absorbed by a steel manufacturer 6 years later. Karl Probst never got rich. He lived quietly. He took other engineering jobs. He did not talk much about the Jeep because talking about it meant explaining what had happened, and explaining what had happened meant reliving the anger and the betrayal. But the vehicle he had designed was about to do something no one had anticipated, not because of what it was, because of what it allowed every other American weapon to do. AST-2A, the Improvement Delmar G ruse did not steal Karl Probst's design. That needs to be said clearly because the history has often been told as if Willys Overland simply took what Bantam had created and slapped their name on it. The truth is more complicated and in some ways more honest. Roos was the vice president of engineering at Willys. Before that, he had been the chief engineer at Studebaker. He was 50 years old in 1940, and he had spent the previous 2 years perfecting the Go Devil, a 60-horsepower engine that could run at full throttle for 100 hours without braking, far superior to the Continental 45-horsepower unit Probst had used. When the army handed Probst's blueprints to Willys and told them to build their own version, Roos looked at the drawings and understood what Probst had done. The design was sound. The geometry was right. The four-wheel drive system would work. But the engine was the weak point. Roos replaced it. He installed the Go Devil in the Willys prototype, and suddenly the little truck that Probst had designed could do everything it had done before, except now it could do it faster, longer, and under heavier loads. The 60-horsepower engine gave the vehicle a 33% increase in power. It could climb steeper grades, it could pull heavier trailers, it could carry more weight across worse terrain without burning out. Ford, meanwhile, contributed something else. They contributed the stamped steel grille with the vertical slats that would become the most recognizable visual signature of the Jeep. It was a manufacturing improvement. Stamped steel was faster and cheaper to produce than a cast grille, but it also became iconic. If you see a Jeep in a photograph from World War II, that grille is what you see first. By July of 1941, the Army had made its decision. The vehicle would be standardized. Willys would produce it as the Model MB. Ford would produce the exact same vehicle with every part interchangeable down to the last bolt as the GPW. The W stood for Willys because Ford was manufacturing under a Willys license. Both companies would use the Go Devil engine, both companies would use the Ford grille, and both companies would use the basic chassis, suspension and drivetrain layout that Karl Probst had drawn in 5 days in the summer of 1940. Production began in earnest after Pearl Harbor. By the time the war ended in 1945, the two factories, Willys in Toledo and Ford in Dearborn, had built approximately 647,000 Jeeps between them. At peak production, the Willys plant was rolling a finished vehicle off the line every 80 seconds. Probst's name appeared nowhere in the production documentation. Bantam, the company that had hired him, built 2,675 vehicles before being pushed out of the production chain entirely. They survived by building trailers, 74,000 of them, designed to be towed behind the Jeeps they could no longer manufacture. Karl Probst would live quietly, take other jobs, and die in Dayton, Ohio in August of 1963 at the age of 79 after a long fight with cancer. But the vehicle he had designed, improved by other men, mass-produced by other companies, and deployed by an army he would never serve in, was about to change the way wars were fought. ACT-2B. The desert in the early summer of 1942, a 26-year-old British officer named David Sterling received a small shipment of American Jeeps at a forward position somewhere in the Egyptian desert. Stirling was a Scots Guards lieutenant who had attended Trinity College, Cambridge, before being sent down for what the university records politely called an accumulation of student transgressions. He had recently recovered from injuries sustained during an experimental parachute jump that had nearly killed him. While lying in a hospital bed in Cairo, he had written a memo arguing that small teams of trained men attacking German airfields by surprise could destroy more enemy aircraft on the ground than the Royal Air Force could destroy in the air. His superiors had hated the idea. Private armies were against regulations. They undermined the chain of command. They created operational chaos. But Stirling had been persuasive, and by the summer of 1942 he had been given permission to form a unit that would eventually be called the Special Air Service. The SS had been conducting raids using trucks provided by the Long Range Desert Group, which the SS troopers had nicknamed the Libyan Desert Taxi Service. The method was simple. The LRDG would drive the raiding teams to the target in heavy Chevrolet trucks. The men would dismount, walk in on foot, plant explosives on parked aircraft, and walk back out. It worked, but it was slow, and as German security around the airfields tightened, it was becoming more dangerous. When Stirling saw the first shipment of American jeeps, he understood immediately what they were. They were not transport, they were a weapon system. He stripped them down, he cut off the windshields, he removed the bumpers. He bolted Vickers K aircraft machine guns to the front and rear of each vehicle, 4 guns per jeep, fed by 60 or 96 round-pan magazines, capable of firing somewhere between 950 and 1,200 rounds per minute. He filled the back of each jeep with jerry cans of fuel, water condensers, ammunition, and the incendiary bombs that an SS officer named Jock Lewes had developed specifically for destroying parked aircraft. On the night of the 26th of July, 1942, 18 modified jeeps, under Stirling's personal command, crossed approximately 50 miles of open desert from a forward position at Bir el Qusir to a German airfield called Sidi Haneish. Sidi Haneish was where the Luftwaffe was staging the bombers and transport aircraft that kept Rommel's Afrika Korps supplied. The Junkers 52 transports parked on that field carried fuel and ammunition. Without them, Rommel's panzers could not move. The 18 jeeps drove onto the airfield in 2 columns, in a V formation, with their headlights off. They navigated by the stars, guided by an LRDG navigator named Mike Sadler, who could read the desert sky the way other men read maps. When Stirling fired a green flare, all 18 jeeps opened fire at once. 72 machine guns. The sound must have been like the end of the world. They drove the length of the airfield in formation, raking the parked aircraft with tracer fire. The Vickers guns tore through aluminum fuselage. Fuel tanks ignited. Ammunition cooked off inside burning aircraft. In approximately 15 minutes, the 18 jeeps destroyed or damaged around 37 Axis aircraft, including the Junkers 52 transports that Rommel's supply line depended on. They lost 1 man at the airfield itself, Lance Bombardier John Robson, 21 years old, killed by return fire as the jeeps withdrew. The next morning, while the surviving jeeps were pulling back across the desert, German Stuka dive bombers caught a French AS detachment in the open and killed a French paratrooper named André Zernheld. The remaining jeeps split into small groups and reached their forward positions days later. Between the summer of 1942 and January of 1943, when David Stirling was finally captured by the Germans in a Tunisian wadi while he was sleeping, the SAS destroyed more than 250 Axis aircraft on the ground in North Africa. They also destroyed fuel dumps, supply depots, and miles of telephone wire. By the regiment's own accounting, that figure exceeded what the Royal Air Force had destroyed on the ground in the same theatre over the same period. Whether or not the comparison was entirely fair, the strategic effect was real. Every Junkers 52 destroyed on the ground at Sidi Haneish was a transport that could not fly fuel and ammunition to Rommel's panzers a few days later. Stirling himself, after being captured, became something of a German obsession. The German press called him the Phantom Major. He was passed up the chain of Paubu custody until, after several escape attempts, he ended up in Colditz Castle in August of 1944, where he remained until the war ended. What the Germans were watching in the desert that summer was something they did not have a functional equivalent for. Not because they did not have small vehicles. They had small vehicles. ACT-2C. The enemy's verdict, the German Army's light reconnaissance vehicle, was called the Kübelwagen. It was a Volkswagen Type 82, designed by Ferdinand Porsche himself. It was painted in desert tan. It had a flat, smooth underbody, an air-cooled engine in the rear, and a sloping front end that terminated in a single curved fender. The bucket seats were comfortable. The construction was elegant. It was, by any reasonable aesthetic standard, a better-looking vehicle than the American Jeep. But it was not the Jeep. The Kübelwagen had two-wheel drive. The air-cooled engine produced approximately 24 to 25 horsepower. It was an excellent passenger car that had been adapted for military service. It could transport officers across reasonable terrain very effectively. What it could not do was go where the Jeep went. When German units captured American Jeeps in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, in France, they did not abandon them. They did not reluctantly use them as temporary transportation until something better came along. They repainted them with German crosses and pressed them into regular service. They did this so often that Wehrmacht vehicle inventories had to be officially amended to account for captured American Jeeps in German units. This was not a matter of desperation. The German army was still producing Kübelwagens by the tens of thousands. They had vehicles. What they did not have was a vehicle that could do what the Jeep could do. In the autumn of 1943, American engineers in the United States acquired one of these captured Kübelwagens, shipped back from North Africa specifically for evaluation, and tested it side by side with a standard Jeep. They measured every component. They timed it on slopes. They ran it through sand pits and water crossings. The results were documented in a War Department intelligence handbook published on the 15th of March, 1945. The handbook was classified. Fewer than 1,000 copies were printed. It was called Technical Manual E13 of 451, Handbook on German Military Forces. The verdict was direct. The Volkswagen, the German equivalent of the American Jeep, is inferior in every way except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. The Jeep had four-wheel drive that could be engaged in high range while the vehicle was moving. It could climb steep grades that the Kübelwagen could not attempt. It could ford 18 inches of water without preparation, and substantially more with the deep water fording kit the Army had developed for amphibious landings. It could tow a trailer carrying nearly half its own weight. The Go Devil engine produced 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute and could run for days at full throttle without braking. It could be repaired by a soldier with a wrench, a hammer, and a basic mechanical understanding. The Kübelwagen was a finely engineered vehicle built by specialists for a specific purpose. The Jeep was a tool that any soldier could use to solve any problem in any place without waiting for permission. That difference between a beautiful design and a functional weapon was about to become visible on every front where American forces fought. ACT-2D, the men lived. The most important thing the Jeep did in World War II was not destroy enemy aircraft or transport commandos across deserts. The most important thing it did was save American lives. By 1943, a standard battlefield modification had emerged across nearly every theater of operation. Soldiers welded steel brackets onto the rear of the Jeep that could carry 2 stretcher cases lying flat. If the casualty count was severe, a third stretcher could be mounted across the hood. The trucks of the medical units could not reach the forward foxholes. They were too heavy, too slow, and too visible. They got stuck in mud. They drew artillery fire. The Jeeps could get there. They drove through shell fire with red crosses painted on canvas tarps, picked up men who had been hit minutes earlier, and carried them back across broken ground to the battalion aid stations where surgeons could still save them. The ride was brutal. The Jeep's suspension was not designed for comfort, but it was fast, and in battlefield medicine, speed was the difference between a man who lived and a man who bled out waiting for help. The statistics tell the story more clearly than any individual account. In World War I, approximately 8% of American soldiers who were wounded died of their wounds. In World War II, that figure fell to approximately 4%. The improvement was the result of many things: sulfur drugs, plasma transfusions, penicillin, which became widely available from 1943 onward. Forward surgical hospitals positioned closer to the fighting, air evacuation for the most critical cases, but the foundation of that entire system, the first link in the chain that gave a wounded man a chance to survive, was forward casualty evacuation by jeep. The jeeps went where nothing else could go. They brought the wounded back before shock could kill them. They did it thousands of times in every theater under conditions that would have immobilized heavier vehicles. There is a war correspondent named Ernie Pyle who wrote about this better than anyone else. Pyle was 44 years. He had ridden in jeeps from North Africa to Italy to France, writing dispatches for American newspapers that tried to explain what the war looked like from the perspective of the ordinary soldier. On the 4th of June, 1943, writing from somewhere in North Africa, he composed a paragraph that would later be collected in his book, Here Is Your War. The line is worth quoting in full. The jeep, good Lord, I don't think we could continue the war without the jeep. It does everything. It goes everywhere. It's as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It constantly carries twice what it was designed for, and still keeps on going. It doesn't even ride so badly after you get used to it. Ernie Pyle was killed by a Japanese machine gun on the island of Ieshima on the 18th of April, 1945. He was 2 weeks away from seeing Germany surrender. AST-2E, the enemy's desperation on the 22nd of October 1944, Adolf Hitler summoned an SS lieutenant colonel named Otto Skorzeny to his headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Skorzeny was 36 years old. He was 6'4". He had a prominent scar on his left cheek from a fencing match in his university days. He had been given the propaganda credit a year earlier for the glider raid that freed Mussolini from captivity atop the Gran Sasso mountain in Italy, even though the operation had actually been planned and led by a Luftwaffe paratrooper officer named Harold Moors. Hitler had a new mission for him. Germany was preparing a final desperate offensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The goal was to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the British and Americans to negotiate a separate peace before the Soviet Union could overrun Germany from the east. Hitler wanted Skorzeny to do something that had never been attempted on this scale in modern warfare. He wanted Skorzeny to assemble a brigade of English-speaking German soldiers, dress them in American uniforms, equip them with American vehicles, and send them through the American lines in the opening hours of the attack. Their mission would be to seize bridges over the Meuse River, cut telephone lines, redirect traffic, misdirect reinforcements, and create enough confusion in the American rear areas to paralyze the Allied response. The operation was code-named Griffin. Skorzeny submitted his requirements to the German High Command. He requested 15 captured tanks, 20 armored cars, 20 self-propelled guns, 100 American jeeps, 40 motorcycles, and 120 trucks. He also requested appropriate quantities of American uniforms, weapons, and identification papers. He was promised 20 Sherman tanks. He received approximately 2, and only one of them was operational. He received 4 scout cars, about 30 jeeps, and roughly 15 trucks. The remainder he had to make up by painting German vehicles Oldrab and stenciling white stars on them. The jeeps were the critical component. Skorzeny did not request 100 jeeps because he was being greedy or because he did not trust German vehicles. He requested 100 jeeps because he and every officer under his command understood exactly what the Americans understood. The jeep would go where German vehicles could not. And any American military policeman at a checkpoint would wave a jeep through without thinking twice. The operation was a tactical failure. Of the approximately 2,500 volunteers Skorzeny screened for the mission, he found only about 10 who spoke fluent American English with proper idiom. Another 30 or 40 spoke passable English without slang. The rest were marginal at best. Skorzeny himself, in his post-war memoir, wrote that the linguistic result was terrifying. The commandos who did manage to penetrate American lines in stolen jeeps accomplished very little in terms of actual sabotage. A few cut telephone wires, a few misdirected traffic, most were caught within hours, but the psychological effect was catastrophic. American sentries across the entire Ardennes front began stopping every jeep they did not personally recognize. Soldiers were questioned about baseball statistics, state capitals, and the identities of cartoon characters. General Omar Bradley, the command of the 12th Army Group, was briefly detained at a checkpoint when he correctly answered that the capital of Illinois was Springfield, because the military policeman who stopped him believed the capital was Chicago. General Eisenhower, when intelligence officers warned him that Skorzeny's commandos might be attempting to assassinate him, was effectively confined to his headquarters at Versailles for several days during Christmas of 1944. A handful of German commandos in stolen jeeps came closer to paralyzing the Allied chain of command than entire German divisions managed during the same offensive. Approximately 18 of Skorzeny's commandos were captured while wearing American uniforms. Under the laws of war, that was a capital offense. The first three, Manfred Penasse, Günther Billing, and Wilhelm Schmidt, were tried by an American military court at Henri-Chapelle in Belgium on the 21st of December 1944. They were convicted and executed by firing squad on the 23rd. Most of the remaining executions took place at Henri-Chapelle in two further groups before the end of the month. Skorzeny himself surrendered in May of 1945. He was tried before an American military tribunal at Dachau between the 18th of August and the 9th of September 1947 on charges of improper use of enemy uniforms in combat. He and 9 other officers of his brigade were acquitted, in part on testimony from a former British Special Operations executive officer who confirmed that Allied special forces had themselves contemplated wearing enemy uniforms under certain circumstances. Skorzeny lived another 28 years. The captured American Jeep, the vehicle that German propaganda had once mocked as a toy, had been the operational centerpiece of his most ambitious mission of the war. It was the vehicle his own army could not match, and by the winter of 1944 everyone on both sides of the conflict understood that. ACT-3A. By the time the war ended, in August of 1945, Willys had built roughly 362,000 jeeps. Ford had built roughly 280,000. American Bantam, the company that had started it all, built 2,675 before being pushed out of production entirely. At peak output, the Willys plant in Toledo was completing one finished Jeep every 80 seconds. The assembly line ran in shifts around the clock. Workers bolted frames together, dropped in engines, mounted wheels, painted olive drab, and sent the vehicles down the line to waiting transport trucks that carried them to ports on both coasts. From there, the jeeps went everywhere. An American infantry regiment in the field was issued approximately 145 jeeps. A glider infantry regiment had 24. A parachute infantry regiment had 17, delivered behind enemy lines by glider, because the technology to parachute drop a vehicle that heavy did not yet exist. There was no equivalent in any other army in the war. Not British, not French, not German. The British used jeeps alongside their own vehicles, but they did not produce anything comparable. King George VI was photographed standing beside American jeeps throughout the war. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery used a jeep alongside his Humber staff car. Approximately 50,000 jeeps were sent to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, where Russian troops called them Willys and used them as command vehicles for officers all the way to Berlin. But the American army was the only force in the war that was built, from the organizational level up around the assumption that every unit would have access to these vehicles in the quantities they needed. The modifications were endless. Soldiers in the field welded brackets onto the backs of jeeps and turned them into stretcher carriers. They mounted pipes on the front bumpers and turned them into wire cutters that could slice through German telephone lines strung along the Normandy hedgerows. They laid steel rails across the floors and turned them into railway maintenance vehicles that could travel on the tracks of captured French trains. They mounted Browning .50 caliber machine guns on pintle mounts and turned them into mobile heavy weapons platforms. They stretched canvas tarps over frames and turned them into field ambulances. On the volcanic ash beaches of Iwo Jima, jeeps sank to their axles where heavier trucks could not even start, and the surviving jeeps still carried wounded Marines off the beaches in numbers the medical evacuation plans had not anticipated. On the Lado Road in the China-Burma-India theatre, jeeps carried medical supplies and ammunition up jungle trails the British had concluded were impassable during monsoon season. None of these modifications were designed in Detroit or Toledo. They were designed in the field by sergeants and corporals and privates using welding torches, salvaged parts, and the same practical mechanical instinct that had once turned Henry Ford's Model T into 1,000 different farm tools across the American Midwest in the 1920s. The most extreme modification was probably the airborne jeep. To make a jeep fit through the cargo door of a glider, ground crews removed the windshield, cut off the bumper ends, took off the hand grips, and stripped away any tools or equipment not strictly required for operation. The lightened vehicle, lashed to the glider's deck with steel cables, weighed only a few £100 less than a standard jeep, but now it fit. British glider regiments in Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault on Arnhem in September of 1944, landed jeeps this way and used them to tow 6-pounder anti-tank guns into the streets where the 1st Airborne Division would make its stand at the bridge. American jeeps came in by Waco glider with the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions across northern France, the Netherlands, and into Germany. In Operation Varsity, the airborne crossing of the Rhine on the 24th of March, 1945, more than 200 jeeps came in with a single regiment. The vehicle that Karl Probst had designed in 5 days had become something no one had quite anticipated, not a weapon, a force multiplier. ACT-3B. To contrast the German army of 1944 was not a mechanized army. That image, the image most people carry panzer divisions smashing across European borders in a thunder of steel and gasoline, was true only for a small percentage of the force at the cutting edge. Behind that edge, the bulk of the German army moved the way armies had moved since antiquity, on foot, with horses. Germany entered the war in 1939 with approximately 514,000 horses on its military rolls. By the opening of the Soviet campaign in 1941, that number had grown to about 750,000. By February of 1945, with German factories collapsing under Allied bombing, the Wehrmacht was using roughly 1.2 million horses. That was more than twice the number they had used to invade Poland. Across the entire war, the German army employed something close to 2.75 million horses, more than they had used in the First World War. They used horses because they did not have enough trucks, they did not have enough fuel, and they did not have a vehicle like the jeep that could be produced in the quantities needed and operated by soldiers with minimal training. The American Army of 1944 did not have that problem. The American Army of 1944 had jeeps, and it had them in overwhelming numbers. In an American battalion in the field, communication wire could be laid, casualties could be evacuated, reconnaissance could be conducted, and forward elements could be resupplied at the same time, because each of those tasks was being performed by a different jeep moving on a different route. A German battalion attempting the same tasks had to do them sequentially, often on foot, often with horse-drawn carts. The difference was not just mechanical, it was philosophical. The Germans had built the Kübelwagen as a finished object, a refined design produced in modest numbers by specialists. It did one thing very well: transport officers across reasonable terrain. The Americans had built the Jeep as an unfinished object, a simple, repairable platform produced in overwhelming numbers and modified in the field by the men who used it. It did one thing: get from here to there with whatever you needed to carry across any terrain on Earth. The first answer was the answer of a culture that trusted engineers. The second was the answer of a culture that trusted everybody. ACT 3C. Eisenhower's verdict in 1948, 3 years after the war ended, Dwight Eisenhower published his memoir of the campaign in Europe. The book was called Crusade in Europe. Buried in the middle of that book, on a page that most readers probably skimmed past on their way to the accounts of D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower wrote a single sentence that has been quoted by every serious historian of American military logistics since. 4 other pieces of equipment that most senior officers came to regard as among the most vital to our success in Africa and Europe were the bulldozer, the Jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 airplane. Curiously enough, none of these is designed for combat. None of them was designed for combat. That sentence is important. The most consequential American equipment of World War II, by the assessment of the man who had commanded the entire Allied effort in Europe, was not the equipment that fired the bullets. It was the equipment that moved the men with the bullets to where the bullets needed to be. The Jeep had not won battles. The Jeep had allowed every other American weapon to win battles. ACT 3D. The German analysis beginning in 1945, the United States Army Historical Division undertook a project that no other military in history had attempted on quite this scale. They had captured most of the surviving senior officers of the German armed forces, and they wanted to know what those officers had thought in real time about the war they had just lost. Most of the work was conducted at 2 facilities in the German state of Hesse, Allendorf and Neustadt. The project was supervised by American officers, including a colonel named Harold Potter, and overseen by a German chief editor named Franz Halder, who had been the chief of the German General Staff before being dismissed by Hitler in 1942. The program was called the Foreign Military Studies Series. It eventually produced approximately 2,500 manuscripts, most of which now reside at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. They constitute the largest single collection of senior German military analysis of the Second World War that exists anywhere in the world. In those manuscripts, German generals were asked to explain why they had lost. They blamed Hitler's interference in operational decisions. They blamed the weather. They blamed the strategic bombing campaign. They blamed the numerical superiority of the Soviet Union. They rarely named the Jeep directly. They did not have to. They named the consequences. The speed at which American units could shift forces from one sector to another. The depth at which American reconnaissance penetrated German lines before being detected. The rate at which American casualties were evacuated and, in many cases, returned to combat. The relentless pressure American forward elements could maintain because supply never stopped reaching them. Every one of those advantages on the ground came down to the small 4-wheel drive truck that could carry everything an American battalion needed at a speed no German equivalent could match. The Wehrmacht's behavior told the story more clearly than their words. They captured American Jeeps and repainted them. They used them in their most desperate operations. They built their logistics around a horse-drawn transport system that belonged to the 19th century, while watching the Americans operate with a level of motorized mobility that redefined what modern warfare could look like. By the end, the gap was structural. The German army of 1944 was a foot army with a mechanized spearhead. The American Army of 1944 was the first largely motorized army in the history of warfare, and the foundation of that transformation was not a tank. It was the Jeep. ACT-3E. The man Karl Probst never became wealthy from the vehicle he designed. The historical record does not tell us much about what he did between 1941 and 1963. He took other engineering jobs. He lived quietly in Ohio. He did not give interviews. He did not write a memoir. If he felt anger about what had happened to him, and the contemporary accounts suggest that he did, he kept that anger private. In 1948, the Federal Trade Commission ruled, after a lengthy investigation, that the original design honors for the Jeep belonged to neither Willys Overland nor Ford Motor Company, but to the American Bantam Car Company. By that point, Bantam no longer existed. It had been absorbed by a steel manufacturer in 1956. The factory in Butler, Pennsylvania, where Karl Probst had drawn the first blueprints in the summer of 1940, was eventually torn down. Probst died in his home in Dayton, Ohio, in August of 1963. He was 79 years old. He had been fighting cancer for a long time. The local newspaper ran a brief obituary. It did not mention the Jeep. He died, as the historical accounts would later note, nearly forgotten outside a small circle of Jeep enthusiasts and military historians who understood what he had accomplished. David Stirling, the British officer who had turned the Jeep into a weapon system in the Egyptian desert, survived the war. He was released from Colditz when Allied forces liberated the castle in April of 1945. He would go on to become a businessman and, later, a founder of private security companies. He was knighted. He died in 1990. Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent who had written more movingly about the Jeep than perhaps anyone else, was killed by Japanese machine gun fire on the island of Ie-Shima on the 18th of April 1945. He was 2 weeks away from seeing Germany surrender. He was 44 years old. Otto Skorzeny, the German commando who had used captured jeeps for his final desperate operation in the Ardennes, lived another 28 years after being acquitted at Dachau. He died in 1975. Delmar G. Roos, the Willys engineer who had contributed the Go Devil engine that made Probst's design truly functional, remained with Willys after the war. The historical record does not preserve the details of his later life. Most of the Jeeps built during the war were eventually scrapped. The ones that survive are collector's items now, sold at auctions for tens of thousands of dollars to people whose grandfathers or great-grandfathers might have driven them out of a transport ship at Normandy or Salerno or across a beach in the Pacific. ACT-3F. The monument there is no statue of Karl Probst. There is no memorial in Butler, Pennsylvania, that marks the place where he designed the vehicle that would become one of the most important pieces of military equipment in American history. His name does not appear on any monument in Washington, but if you know where to look, if you visit the right museums, the right private collections, the right military vehicle shows, you can still find them. The Jeeps, restored, repainted, maintained by people who understand what they meant. Some still run, some are static displays, some sit in garages owned by veterans or the children of veterans who kept them as a connection to something that mattered. They are not graceful vehicles, they are not comfortable, they are, by any aesthetic standard, utilitarian to the point of ugliness, but they worked. They worked in deserts and jungles and frozen forests. They worked on beaches and mountains and roads that were not really roads at all. They worked when nothing else would, and they kept working until the job was done. 647,000 of them, built by two companies that did not invent them, designed by one man in 5 days who was never properly credited, used by millions of soldiers who never knew his name. Dwight Eisenhower, in his memoir, did not mention Karl Probst, but he understood what the vehicle represented. Curiously enough, he wrote, none of these is designed for combat. The Jeep was not designed to kill, it was designed to move, to carry, to pull. To go where other vehicles could not and bring back the men who needed to come home. That was its purpose. And in a war that killed more than 60 million people across 6 years, that purpose, the ability to move soldiers and supplies and wounded men faster and farther than any army in history had moved them before, turned out to be one of the things that mattered most. Karl Probst died in 1963. The Jeeps he designed are still here, and if you served in one, or rode in one, or knew someone who did, then you know something that most people will never understand. That vehicle saved lives. It might have saved yours, or your father's, or your grandfather's. And the man who drew it in 5 days, who was told it was impossible and did it anyway, who was betrayed by the system he was trying to help and forgotten by the country he helped to save, that man deserves to be remembered, not with a statue, with the truth.